Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Wild Earth Conversations. Wild Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving and beautiful planet. My guest today is Mitch Friedman. Mitch Friedman is an American conservation biologist and activist who founded the organization called Conservation Northwest in 1989, and he still serves as its executive director. He was a leader within the Washington Earth First movement during the 80s and was arrested on multiple occasions for protecting old growth forests in the Northwest. By 1990, he was frustrated with the tactics and strategies of Earth First, and he began to develop new perspectives and programs for achieving the preservation of wildland and wildlife, which he explains in his new book, Conservation Confidential, a wild path to a less polarizing and more effective activism. Welcome, Mitch.
Thank you, Glenn.
Would you give us a summary of your new book?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. For 40 years here in the Northwest, we've seen a lot of amazing conservation progress. I started when ancient forests were being cut at an extraordinary rate, and there was no protection for roadless areas, et cetera. And we had some really big wins. And then we moved from there into the landscape conservation era, where we've been able to protect some large-scale habitat corridors, restore connectivity in key places, and then bring back carnivores. Over the last 20 years, Washington has seen the return of wolverines, wolves, fishers, and lynx that were missing from parts of the state. So all of that adds up to a pretty great run that I've been fortunate to be part of and have perspective on and learn lessons from. I mean, as you said, I started out on the radical edge. Civil disobedience protests, monkey wrenching, a lot of chest beating commentary. And over time, was able to try different tactics, including the birth of collaborative forest conservation tactics here, and then collaborative tactics with respect to wolf recovery and in other areas. So, I've developed fairly strong views on what works best, not just in conservation, but I think in progressive movements generally. I have opinions on that. And there are some observations that I have of the conservation movement that are somewhat critical. And I think it's important for us all to be honest with our own tribes, our own movement. And my book is an effort to do that. So it chronicles my experience through all that, through the different tactics, through the different wins, through breakthroughs and setbacks, and the lessons that I've learned. And some of those lessons are about tactics, but some of them are also about ecology. What have we learned in recent decades from fire science? What does that tell us about the relationship that Native peoples had with the landscape over the last 12,000 years? And what do those observations and those the new knowledge we have of that history tell us about our concepts of wilderness and where those concepts ought to be applied and maybe where they shouldn't? So my book is all of that, which is kind of a lot, considering that it's a pretty short book. But I hope I make the case fairly well.
Well, thank you for that very clear statement. So let's go first to a controversial part of your book. There are people in the environmental community, myself included, who find some of the things you say problematic. So maybe a discussion of them will enlighten everyone. So my first question is, in chapter 13 of your book, you argue that pre-European America was not a wilderness because Indians used and modified the landscape, mostly through fire. I quote you, quote, "Nature wasn't a big wilderness before the Pilgrims. While there were pockets of wilderness, most areas were actively managed by Native Americans," end quote. Most people would say just the reverse, namely that there were pockets of land managed by Native Americans, but most areas were wilderness. So your response?
Yeah, I think my view is more accurate. I mean, certainly people were not living in the harsher environments on top of the mountains, in the toughest deserts, in the massive swamps. But people were living in, various densities across the landscape everywhere that wasn't extreme. I give a good example in there. It's hard for us to know. There's no firsthand written accounts of what life was like pre-disease, right? Or there aren't very many firsthand accounts. You can't go back 600 years other than archaeological evidence and fire history, pollen records, things like that. But one firsthand account was a Spanish armada got blown up in the Gulf of Mexico, and a few dozen Spanish people, including a man named Cabeza de Vaca, moved from the Florida Panhandle all the way west and then south to reunite with Cortez in Mexico City several years later. And, he wrote a report on that to the Spanish king. And so this group of people were moved incrementally by various tribes. Some enslaved them, some just passed them along. And so his descriptions of the cultures that he encountered are rather amazing and varied. Some people lived in pretty rich habitats and had good lifestyles. Others existed in parts of the year on spiders, waiting for the prickly pears to bloom. Why wouldn't it be that way? Of course, over 12,000 years, humans are going to colonize and occupy every area that would sustain them, not just the most, productive acres. The people who could defend such areas, occupy and defend them, would do so. But there would be other people that would be forced to the margins and would have to make a living in more marginal habitats. So people were widely distributed. And there's really good archaeological evidence of substantial cities and places, not just the Maya, but, cultures across North America and America, and all sorts of ecosystems. And then fire, cultural fire, what we know about it today, based on fire histories reconstructed from tree rings on old stumps and other evidence like that, indicates just an extraordinary amount of fire. I cite some recent research in my book that, if I'm remembering correctly, estimated that the average annual acres burned in the pre-colonial West was about 10 times our present most extreme years. And a lot of that would have been fairly modest, cool fire, because fire would be encouraged and in cases lit every few years to clear brush, to open sight lines, to reinvigorate soils, stimulate browse for huntable ungulates, all these reasons. But not all of it was cool. Some of it was quite intense. I think there's good evidence for that's how the landscape was. And the notion that we formerly had, that Indians lived in small communities in just certain places and lived with a light touch on the land, I don't think that's defensible anymore.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this question. I'm sure that you would agree that we cannot and should not argue about facts. But what I would like to know is, why is it important to you that people think about pre-Columbian North America as not a wilderness?
It's a great question. First of all, I want to modify that a little bit. By not a wilderness, maybe we should say preponderantly not a wilderness.
Okay, fair enough.
I certainly allow, again, that the mountains, the harsher environments like mountains and deserts and swamps were wild. But to your question, for the areas that I argue were not wild, why is it important that we not think of them as wild? My argument for that is biodiversity. If I'm correct that for 12,000 years, and it's not just me, I think this is the kind of the body of science and scientific thinking at this point on the pre-colonial landscape. If Native Americans, if Indians, if indigenous people were interacting with their landscape in a fairly substantial way for 12,000 years, with fire being the major way, then those ecosystems have co-evolved to that regime of human interaction. And if we disrupt that, as we have for the last 100 years with fire exclusion, Smokey Bear, et cetera, then that has a biodiversity impact. And this really comes to a head in forest management and dry forests. My organization, promotes active management to restore fire-resilient dry forests, typified by cutting the little trees and leaving the large ones and using managed fire on the landscape every few years to maintain that structure. And heterogeneity, not every acre looks the same. We believe that's how the landscape was pre-colonial. We believe that's the healthiest landscape for biodiversity and for other reasons. And we encounter resistance from organizations who have a healthy skepticism, not just of chainsaws and of the Forest Service and of the timber industry, but of the notion that these forests benefit from active management to restore and maintain them in what I argue was their pre-colonial and therefore their natural state, or more natural
all right.
state.
I understand that argument. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. So let me ask you this question. Do you think there is something inherently wrong and objectionable about the 1964 Wilderness Act that seeks to set aside humans as only visitors and so on.
No, absolutely not. I'm a big supporter of the Wilderness Act and of wilderness, where I argue that it is the right fit. And again, that tends to be the places that were the harsher environments that did not have 12,000 years of human engagement and management.
Okay, those areas, you're basically, from your book, limit wilderness to swamps, deserts, and mountains. So do you think it's fair to relegate animal life to the most inhospitable places on Earth?
Oh, absolutely not. I'd argue the opposite. First of all, let me take the first part of your sentence,
Okay.
Glenn. I think the Wilderness Act and wilderness designation can be appropriate applied outside of just those harshest environments that I described.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to be able to encourage, certain influences in those areas. So, for instance, the roadless policy, doesn't preclude thinning. It precludes roads. But you could thin a dry forest inside a roadless area. You couldn't really do it in wilderness except with fire. Just fire, not with a chainsaw.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be okay. But we need to be really clear about that fire. We want to encourage that fire. We even may want to set that fire. We may want to manage that fire so that we get a heterogeneous mosaic of forest types or grasslands within that wilderness area that encourages not only biodiversity, but also, historically characteristic fire patterns. So I think we want to be careful about excluding all management from all wilderness.
Okay.
So now the second part of your question, should wildlife be constrained to the harshest environment? I challenge your assumptions there. My argument that I've been making on this conversation encourages wildlife outside wilderness. I think your question has a faulty assumption, which is that wilderness is the place that wildlife live. That's not how I observe the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll come back to that, okay? Let me go on with this question, and some of these questions might be a bit redundant or not in perfectly logical sequence because I had to write them before the interview. But here we go. Major influences of the 1964 Wilderness Act, men such as Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, did not understand wilderness as pristine or untouched by humans, but rather they thought of it as land that retains its, quote, primeval appearance, and where the activities of human beings are, quote, substantially unnoticeable, and concepts such as untrammeled by humans, where humans are visitors, and so on. So my question is, do you think it is impossible to achieve this standard outside of these areas that you grant were wilderness? Would you agree that large designated wilderness areas in America meet this standard of the 1964 Wilderness Act, or they could meet this standard if some of the compromises that were made in order to pass the bill into law were eliminated?
It's a great question. Aldo Leopold also had that rule of thumb that a definition of wilderness was something that took 2 weeks to cross on a pack horse. wouldn't that be frickin' lovely? If we could have a landscape that met all those standards, that felt untrammeled by man, that didn't have the evidence of human interference, stumps, gravel roads, all of those things, yet still displayed the ecological characteristics that I argue are best for biodiversity, because they had co-evolved over 12,000 years of certain patterns of human use. That would be awesome. That would be awesome. But it's not always practical. And when I say it would be awesome, I mean that from a human perspective. I'd love to hang out in those types of areas. Mm-hmm. But if we force a binary choice, just for sake of argument, if we say wilderness is a place that's pristine and unmanaged, and management is precluded and resisted and obstructed, and by management I even include, fire management. If it's either that or a clear cut, mm-hmm. That's a tough choice because neither of those is healthy.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let me make a comment here and get your response to it. After reading your book twice, I think that for example, you make this statement. You said, quote, "What John Muir described as wilderness was an illusion," end quote. Now, this strikes me as an extreme statement. And I think that after reading your book twice, it may be driven by your adoption of what you call an indirect strategy, in which compromise and consensus is the best way, the most effective way, according to you, to succeed environmentally or ecologically. Is it possible that your understanding of wilderness, what I would say your minimization of its importance, is driven by your political desire to succeed in reaching agreement with others? After all, wilderness is a high standard of land protection, and it is difficult for people to agree on it.
I'd say no, Glenn. I respect the question. And I'd encourage you to ask tough questions like that. But to start out, my description or my critique of Muir's view of wilderness was specific to Sierra forests. And he described, I was reacting to Muir describing Sierra forests as wild. And those Sierra forests are exactly the type of dry forest where I would argue almost certainly, like almost 100% certainty, there was a profound, ongoing, very active level of human management, fire management, over 12 millennia in those Sierra forests.
But do you really want to say that John Muir's books describing his experiences and love of wilderness in the Sierra Mountains, that he was not describing wilderness?
Particular to those Sierra forests. Right. I mean, when John Muir's reveling in the high Sierra, absolutely that was wilderness. When John Muir's in the Arctic, and there's parts of the Arctic that absolutely were wilderness. There's places where the concept pertains quite well. but those in those Sierra forests where that quote and my reaction to it were specific to, fire was a big deal, and fire had been excluded for 100 years before John Muir. And so he was observing a modified landscape, not what I would argue was a natural pre-colonial landscape.
Well, that's certainly a minority point of view. I can't agree with that myself. But let me move on here to what I think is a key issue here. The best science of conservation biology, represented by people such as Michael Soule, Reed Noss, Dave Parsons, and many other conservation biologists, show that sustaining biodiversity, especially apex predators, requires large areas of wilderness as defined by the 1964 Wilderness Act. From reading your book, I don't think you understand how much wilderness is necessary to end the sixth extinction.
You know, I used to say things like that too. I don't think it stands up. You know, wolverines have come back into Washington. Wolverines are our most iconic symbol of wilderness. They're our most reclusive species. They hate people. They den in, north-facing deep snow environments. When people come near, they abandon their dens. Mm-hmm. Wolverine have also been showing up near the pizza parlor in Westport, Washington, and been seen eating seals on the beach of the Pacific coast. It's amazing the range of behaviors that wildlife exhibit. Grizzly bears, in my first book, I applied all the research on, how roads are exclusionary to grizzly bear. And I used to resent the research of Bruce McClellan, the British Columbian grizzly bear biologist, who argued it wasn't the roads, it was the use of the roads. Mm-hmm. And over time, the research has borne him out. I think, so two things, Glenn. The sixth extinction epic that you referred to is different than the megafauna you referred to. I think we've got a massive extinction problem that applies to everything from lichens to amphibians to plants. And I think we're making an error if we apply charismatic megafauna, which are useful to think of as umbrella species for ecosystem health, but I don't think they're useful to think of as representative of the extinction crisis, because I think we're seeing that a lot of those megafauna, or some of those megafauna that we've adopted as totems of the conservation movement in the American West, are more generalist and resilient. They're not the ones suffering the extinction crisis that you might be seeing in amphibians and endemic plants and things like that. Mm-hmm. I think the most profound impact we've had on the megafauna was typified by how until probably the 1970s, every pickup truck had a rifle on its rack, and people shot everything that moved. I think things like the roadless area protection policy, the designations of wilderness, the Northwest Forest Plan, I think there are things that we've done in land conservation that have certainly helped our carnivores, like fishers, for instance. But I think the main thing that has helped them is that people aren't shooting them and poisoning and trapping them the way we used to 50 years ago.
Okay. All right. So let me get your response to this. Uh, as a scientist and a believer in the scientific method, you surely agree that scientific truth does not depend on a multitude of perspectives from ranchers, farmers, developers, recreationists, hunters, and those in affected communities. Science is not about finding common ground.
Correct.
Okay, so in your book, this great emphasis that you place on collaboration and consensus, sometimes, in my opinion, flies in the face of the science of conservation biology, which is telling us that large wilderness areas, large enough, connected enough, and diverse enough, is necessary to sustain at least 90% or more of the biodiversity on Earth. That just seems, in my understanding, to be the scientific truth about sustaining biodiversity. And so you can seek all the collaboration and all the consensus from a diversity of interests as you want. The truth is the truth.
That's a tough one, Glenn. I can think of scenarios in which I'd agree with you, and certainly others which I wouldn't. Science is not gospel. Science is a process. Science continually evolves as we learn more. And we already know, I think it's rare these days, a scientist who would object to the characterization of traditional ecological knowledge among indigenous peoples as, quote, other ways of knowing. So we're already in the scientific world trying to reconcile the method of peer-reviewed science with this other method of traditional ecological knowledge. Rare would be the scientist who would say, oh, those Indians don't know what they're talking about. So, that's a challenging thing because sometimes the traditional ecological knowledge keeper is saying something different than the scientist.
Okay.
And we have to allow that both of them are operating from limited data sets. Like the way you characterize science there as a gospel is difficult for me because a lot of times the science we're referring to is changing over time because we're learning. And at every point, we have incomplete knowledge. Think about trophic cascade theory. Think about how we used to talk about that 20 years ago. Yellowstone wolf reintroduction and how that impacted the ungulates and therefore how it impacted the aspen and the willows and therefore how it impacted the beavers. And oh my God, what a transformation. We don't talk about it that way anymore because that's not how the peer-reviewed science is tended to play out.
Okay. Well, let me elaborate a little bit on this or get more specific since you mentioned the Indians. So you say, I'll give a quote from your book, quote, "The relationship of Indians to wildlife may upset animal rights and anti-logging absolutists, but as sovereign nations, they have a right to manage as they choose," quote. So my question to you is, do sovereign nations, including Indian nations, have the right to pursue economic activities that undermine the Endangered Species Act? Does the sovereign nation of Japan, for example, have the right to harvest whales? I believe the right of all life forms to live and flourish takes precedence over all human economic activities. for both modern and traditional lifestyles. The Southern Ute Indian tribe opposed the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado here. As environmentalists, are we supposed to accept this as just their choice?
Yes. I mean, and I think that's a different example than the nation of Japan. There are different scales and types of sovereign nations. The Utes, and, you know, this is an issue we're dealing with right now because Washington State has been asked, urged, badgered by the state of Colorado to provide Colorado with wolves.
Right.
And, you know, the Calvo Confederated Tribes of Washington were 2 years ago prepared to send wolves over, and then the Utes took that position. I think the position of the Utes is not necessarily anti-wolf. Their concern was how they were consulted. And secondly, and I'm projecting here because I don't really know the basis of their position, but it may have something to do with whether they wanted wolves manually reintroduced or a more natural recolonization. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So I think the more direct answer to the question is, I think when an indigenous nation like the Utes takes a position with respect to an ecological issue, that we as conservationists need to pause and think. The ways we need to pause and think are not idealizing or putting Indians on some kind of a noble savage pedestal. We need to think about what's the basis for their position. Does it maybe reflect traditional ecological knowledge, or is it maybe driven by some other consideration by the tribe? Do we agree with that or not?
Here's another response I have to your book. I'm not sure that you understand a genuine wilderness experience is only possible in a place where artifacts, human artifacts and activities are, quote, substantially unnoticeable, end quote. Agricultural fields and cows grazing in the meadows and riparian areas, for example, regardless of how they are managed, damages a genuine wilderness experience. I do not find in your book an awareness that humans need a genuine wilderness experience as defined by the 1964 Wilderness Act.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, I could reverse that. I mean, I've read your writings arguing that humans need that genuine wilderness experience. I love wilderness. I love being in wilderness. I think humans are better for wilderness. There's 8 billion people on the planet. My organization has a program for how wildlife and recreationists can coexist because Seattleites love their backcountry and they swarm all over it and are completely unaware of their impact on wilderness. So Glenn is arguing that wilderness is essential to the human spirit. Mm-hmm. Mitch is arguing that maybe the human spirit isn't so great for the wilderness, and those two things might be irreconcilable. And I also think that your argument that humans need wilderness, one could easily construct arguments against it. There's plenty of people in the world that live rich lives that don't experience wilderness in the way you describe, that there might be degrees of naturalness that could meet the needs of the human spirit. Forest bathing, that Japanese concept, people get that walking through a woodlot. So that's all debatable, but we're stuck with it. Mm-hmm. We're stuck with it. it's like the last question of the position that Utes take on the matter of wolves. You know, if there's a practical side of this stuff that if we can't find areas of agreement with tribal communities that...
Hello? Oh my goodness, lost him again. Isn't that a shame? You've been listening to Wild Earth Conversations on KWSI 100.3 Radio in Grand Junction. More conversations in this series are available at kwsiradio.org or on KWSI's YouTube channel. If you have comments or questions about the show, or if you would like to be a guest, then send me an email at wildearthconversations@kwsiradio.org. Please include a phone number. Thank you.